Good evening, everyone. The webinar has started. We have our lovely guest speaker, and I'm going to quickly do a little introduction into the night school. So my name is Tia Van Hester, and I am an assistant professor of race, gender, and sexuality studies at Butler University. And it's my distinct honor to welcome you to our inaugural RGSS Feminist Night School entitled Feminisms at the Border, History, Solidarity, and Palestine. The RGSS Feminist Night School is committed to mobilizing social justice work, literacies, and activism beyond the university. As RGSS scholar activists, we strive to amplify work being done to achieve liberation, sovereignty, and justice. We believe in education, community, and solidarity and resistance are all essential in our pursuits for freedom. We believe that healing, truth, and joy serve as our guiding frameworks, and we believe in the power of hope and humility as key forces to prevail over hatred and harm. Butler's Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program is an interdisciplinary program that houses both major and a minor. RGSS is founded on the premise that gender, sexuality, class, race, and other markers of difference are historical and intersectional constructs affecting all people. This program has over 30 faculty affiliates and offers students a unique opportunity to question and challenge the power structures that perpetrate privilege and inequity, providing a formulated setting for students to interrogate identity and agency locally and globally and across time and space. No work in RGSS is completed in isolation. The RGSS Feminist Night School would not have been possible without the fierce solidarity of my comrades, Dr. Mira Asaf Kafantaris and Dr. Charlene Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Asaf Kafantaris and I had our first meeting regarding this night school on October 28th. This night school would not have been possible without these amazing scholar activists. As junior faculty, we wouldn't be able to host this night school without the fearless commitment and unwavering support of the following people. We would first like to thank Dr. Terry Carney for her guidance as RGSS Program Director, as well as the support of the RGSS Steering Committee. We are grateful for the advocacy for academic freedom provided by Dean Jay Howard and Associate Dean Elise Edwards. This series would not have been possible without the incomparable coordination of Maribeth Peretta. Thank you for all that you do. And finally, the hosts of the RGSS Night School would like to dedicate its inception and inaugural series to Dr. Terry Jett, whose mentorship, guidance, and care have given us this space and the opportunity to occupy it. Tonight's webinar contains roughly 45 to 60 minutes of content. We are committed to having at least 15 minutes of audience Q&A. Please feel free to utilize the Q&A function for any questions that arise regarding the tech. We ask that you wait until the conclusion of the presentation to submit content-related questions to this evening's moderator or guest speaker. If you're unable to stay, no worries. Following the night school series, we will send out the on-demand recordings of each night, along with suggested resources, other upcoming events hosted by RGSS, and a survey, so that you can provide us some feedback on your experience with the Feminist Night School. Tonight's session was skillfully and passionately curated by Dr. Mira Asaf Kafantaris, Assistant Professor of English Language and Literature at Butler University. Without much further ado, I invite Dr. Asaf Kafantaris to steward us into night one of the RGSS Feminist Night School, Feminism at the Border, History, Solidarity, and Palestine.
Thank you so much, Tia. And first, I want to start by really giving all the flowers to Tia for leading the charge on this. I am first also marhaba, assalamu alaikum. I'm Mira Asaf Kafantaris. I'm an Arab and I teach at Butler University in English and RGSS. Since our broad theme is indigenous solidarity, I would like to start with acknowledging the indigenous inhabitants of Butler University, which is located on the traditional homelands of the still living, still sovereign Miami, Piancasho, Shawnee, Eel River, Delaware, and Potawatomi peoples, communities, and nations. We acknowledge the ancestors of this land and their descendants, and we understand that we are on these lands because of white supremacy's genocidal and removal project and its interlocking webs of dispossession. I recognize and honor, and everyone else, the past, present, and future of these communities. It's really my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Abusneineh. I'd like to start with a quote from Michelle Alexander's speech given at the Palestine Festival of Literature on November 1, 2023. Dr. Alexander was quoting Dr. Martin Luther King, whose opposition to the Vietnam War was severely unpopular. She says about Dr. Martin Luther King, and he was right that our conscience must leave us no other choice when the oppressed, the poor, and the weak are under attack, when their homes are stolen or demolished, when they are forced to migrate and to live in unspeakable conditions, in open-air prisons or concentration camps, perpetually as refugees under occupation. We must speak. I would like to welcome Dr. Bayan Abusneineh, who is a provost fellow to faculty in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department at The Ohio State University. She will begin as an assistant professor in the department in the fall of 2024. Her research examines the relationship between racial and reproductive politics in Palestine and Israel, with an emphasis on genocide, family separation, and intimacy. She is an active member of the Faculty for Justice in Palestine at Ohio State, as well as the Palestinian Feminist Collective. In this talk, Dr. Abusneineh will focus on the history of Israel's settler colonial dispossession of Palestinians through an emphasis on gender and reproductive justice and violence, based on the racialized logic of eliminating the native. And this is, of course, Patrick Wolf's. These are his words. Abusneineh will be unraveling how Zionism is premised on the continued removal or erasure of indigenous Palestinian land, culture, and language. By situating today's ongoing onslaught against the Gaza Strip as a project of reproductive genocide, she'll be historicizing how this project began long before October 7th, through an engagement around the rise of Zionism, militarization in the West Bank, the ongoing Nakba, and Palestinian resistance. Ahla wa sahla, the floor is yours, Dr. Abusneineh.
Thank you so much. Am I able to share my screen? I do have some slides, if that's okay. Okay. Oh, it says I'm disabled from it. Is there a way that I can share my screen?
Yeah.
I can only just do the talk without it.
Yeah, no, we will give you
It should work now.
Perfect. Thank you. Does everybody see that? Okay. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Mira, for inviting me to this. This is so exciting. I wanted to also just preface it by saying, please forgive me. I've been like struggling with bronchitis and upper respiratory infection. So if I'm coughing, throughout it, I apologize. I'll try my best not to speak so fast so that I don't have a coughing fit. But I am really, I'm very happy to be here. I obviously wish the circumstances are a little bit different, but it is why we do the work that we do. So, I also want to thank everybody else for being here as well, making space for me. I'm going to try not to take up too much time for this too, so we can leave time for questions. So, as Mira had mentioned, my name is Bayan Abusneineh. I currently teach at the Ohio State University in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies department, but more importantly, I'm a daughter of Palestinian refugees from the 1948 Nakba, from a village in the current West Bank called the Khalil, or Hebron, modern day. I am the granddaughter of Palestinians who found the difficult choice, or who made the difficult choice, to flee the Khalil and Jerusalem to Jordan, and later to the United States in hope of returning, but found themselves completely shut out. This story, which is my story, is a very small part of a larger story of Palestine. Today, I want to tell a larger narrative of Palestine with an emphasis on what everybody is now talking about, Gaza. What we've been seeing and the sort of circulation of images on the news, on social media, is of occupation, blood, cries, tears, death, and destruction. But what you may or may not know is that the land of Gaza is beautiful. Oops. The people of Gaza are some of the most prideful people in the world. We take pride of our city, our history, our land, and our wise elders. Gaza is one of the oldest and biggest, largest Palestinian cities, dating back to 3000 BC. It is considered Palestine's second capital. It holds around 60% of the Palestinian population, making it a block of the Palestinian soul. Overlooking the Mediterranean, Gaza has forever been a painting colored by the refreshing orange and yellow and prudent green of its citruses and olives, scented by their fresh, sour, and sweetened bitter essences. It is a basket of fresh natural fruits. It is historically a major location for trade, for spices. It has been also the home of some of the world's best fish resource. We are proud of our farmers, our fishers, our simplest workers who make this small land a home for large industrial exports. We export fruits, veggies, flowers, furniture, industrial food to all of the Middle East and Europe. Gaza is home to some of the most beautiful beaches and the most gorgeous sunsets. Gaza's whole west side is on the beach. The white sand and the sparkles gold in the sun. The mini sea of bubbly seashells lining from the north to the south. The sound of the waves that reach to you, speaking the same language of the waves around the world, mixed with the sounds of Gaza. Giggles of playing kids, calls of street vendors, fishing boats, seagulls, and families just having a good time. Gaza was not always known for its death and destruction. Their people are not numbers. Their neighborhoods are not just up for grabs by imperial powers. And the people of Gaza continue to live life and resist in ways unimaginable in the face of this death and destruction. Since October 7, Israel has engaged in aerial bombardment against the entire Gaza Strip. According to the Middle East Monitor, as of January 4, excuse me, Israel has dropped more than 65,000 tons of bombs on Gaza in just the first 89 days. It has now been well over 115 days with no end in sight. As Israel continues to pound Gaza with their aerial and ground assaults, the Israeli army has called for a complete siege of Gaza, cutting off all water, power, and fuel supplies in an act of collective punishment. Gaza is home to 2.3 million people living in a place that is the size of Detroit. For the past 17 years, Gaza has been under siege, where Israel has controlled anything coming in and out of Gaza from air, land, and sea. As a result, Gaza has had to rely primarily on international aid for basic goods such as food, water, medical supplies, and other necessities. Gaza is described as the world's largest open-air prison, not simply because movement inside is restricted or is entirely confined, but because the living conditions are severely regulated and penalized, administered by Israel's control of the borders. A resident has now described Gaza as the world's open grave. The New York Times has simply described Gaza as a graveyard for children. In this talk, I want to emphasize three major points. So for the first one, for the past 115 days, there has been an increase of violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. However, it is important to note that this year was already considered one of the most one of the deadliest years in the West Bank, even prior to October 7th. A few reasons why. One, almost 300, I believe the number is a little bit more, and we can talk about what the whole body count actually means and what it actually represents in the Q&A possibly. Almost 300 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank. Reports show that at least 2 people are murdered by Israeli settlers every single day. Massive arrests are happening all across the West Bank. As of January 10, nearly 6,000 Palestinians have been arrested since October 7. More than 3,000 of these 6,000 are actually are arrested through something called administrative detention, which means there's no charge for it. They don't have a right to a trial. So Palestinians have sort of used the term as kidnapping to kind of describe this. Lastly, the Israeli military has carried out airstrikes in major refugee camps in the West Bank cities of Tulkarem and Jenin, resulting in mass deaths, mass evacuations or cleansing of Palestinians, small pockets of land, and mass arrests and detentions, as I've mentioned. The second thing is that Palestinians have called this most current onslaught against Gaza genocidal, not simply because of the growing number of deaths every day, although body count is still very important to understanding genocide, but that the Israeli army is intentionally targeting what I call intimate spaces, spaces of living, and spaces of survival, which include homes, hospitals, schools, UN shelters, bakeries, grocery stores, etc., confining Palestinians in Gaza to a quick and slow death. So even if Palestinians are not killed through aerial assaults, they are subject to starvation. They're subject to illnesses from the cold, from sleeping out in tents. They are subject to illnesses and diseases from contamination and sort of damages of water pipes, as well as, sewage pipes and things like that. The amount of destruction to property, institutions, and universities, and the militarization of homes, hospitals, and schools as legitimate targets for the Israeli armies are all part of a scheme that make Gaza uninhabitable. Even as Israel continues to order evacuations, pushing Palestinians to enter something called safe zones, right, where many of them have actually found that they aren't safe. One example of that is the current neighborhood that we're seeing, Khan Yunis, that's been under constant bombardment, killing almost 200 Palestinians a day for the past week. They have dispossessed over 1.8 million Palestinians from their homes in Gaza, right? And some of the images that I just kind of included there are just a few, since I can't go into everything, just a few other effects that we're not seeing with this body count. We're not seeing the ways that these aerial strikes are causing are maiming or causing physical ailments and disabilities amongst Palestinians, especially amongst children. We're not seeing the sort of ways that Israel has actually kidnapped bodies and refused to return them. Many of them that have returned have had their organs, taken from them. And we haven't thought about the sort of long-lasting effects that this will actually have, especially on children. We haven't even talked about this, what will happen with this and the sort of psychological effects that this will also cause to generations. And then excuse me. The last point of this slide, the 2 mothers killed every hour in Gaza, kind of sheds light to the last the point that I want to make is that this most current onslaught against Gaza and the West Bank is part of a project that I call reproductive genocide. And it illuminates how Israel discursively and materially has targeted Palestinian reproduction since the 1948 Gaza. You could argue that it was well before as well, with the ways that they constructed the land as virgin territory and as land that was inherently, similar to the ways that the Americas were constructed as inherently rapeable. There were similar sort of understandings of the land of Palestine. With over 24,000 Palestinian deaths by Israeli airstrikes, more than 10,000 of these are children. Also in 2008, 2009, the Israeli army released a series of images, or not images, of t-shirts that was circulated amongst the military. I have a few examples up there, but one of them is an image of a visibly pregnant Palestinian woman in hijab inside a crosshair target with the caption, "One shot, two kills." The sort of idea of killing two birds with one stone, right? That Palestinian children or Palestinians are already subjected to premature death well before that they are even born, that they are already constituted as a threat or as terrorists prior to even being born. Hence the sort of logic that's happening today, that this idea of collective punishment, that all of these children, are all, for whatever reason, supporting Hamas, and they are deserving of their fate, this fate. Israeli politicians have disregarded Palestinians as humans, calling for their genocide directly. I don't even know why there's even a debate of whether this is genocide or not, as Israeli politicians have literally admitted to it, right? Referring to them as human animals, calling to flatten the Gaza Strip. And in one case, Ezrael Yachin, a veteran of the Israeli army, says, quote, "We need to wipe their families, their mothers, and their children. These animals must not be allowed to live any longer." And then also I have this news article of Gaza Lives Erased, Israel's wiping out entire Palestinian families on purpose. This is an article from 2014. And this was where 15 Palestinian families in Gaza were essentially wiped out of the civil registry. That number today in this most current onslaught is around 900 families. And I could say more about that. The intentional language of targeting mothers is not a coincidence, but is embedded in Israel's settler colonial project and racialized logic of elimination. To borrow, again, the language of Patrick Wolf, and then other Palestinians who've kind of picked this up, like Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, by cutting off generations. In this most current onslaught, Israel has wiped literally 900 families from the civil registry. It's also really important to note that things like the civil registry have also been targeted and destroyed as well. So records of birth, records of death have also been destroyed, right? It's sort of essentially wiping out the idea that there were ever Palestinians existing to begin with. The aerial strikes and the effects of these strikes has disproportionately targeted women and children. Israel has also targeted things like maternity wards and clinic. I've already talked about the targeting of spaces like homes, shelters, and hospitals, places where families are literally taking refuge from the bombings, and spaces that Israel has ordered Palestinians to evacuate for safety. Excuse me. In addition, over 50,000 Palestinian women are currently pregnant in Gaza, and 5,500 of these women are giving birth each month. Miscarriages in Gaza have skyrocketed more than 300%. Whatever is left of hospitals, and there's a statistic that there is absolutely currently no functioning hospitals as of now in all of the Gaza Strip for over 2.3 million people. So whatever's left of hospitals have run out of fuel, electricity, a lack of access to clean water, and completely run out of anesthetics. So with these injuries that you may have seen with the children, doctors are forced to perform these surgeries that are literally cutting off limbs of children to save them without anesthesias. This also means that doctors are performing deliveries, including C-sections, which is literally cutting 7 layers of tissue without any anesthesia. This means that doctors are performing mass hysterectomies or removal of the uteruses because they're unable to control the bleeding after deliveries. And again, we haven't even talked about the ongoing deployment of new weaponry and nuclear bombings that will create conditions of infertility and birth defects for future generations. So as I make, as I said in the abstract, the most recent attack on Gaza did not begin with the Hamas operation on October 7. But as Palestinians have testified for decades, the root cause of this violence is the colonial violence caused by the Zionist regime, and what scholars of Palestinian studies or Palestine studies have argued as the ongoing Nakba. Israel does not simply have a problem with Hamas or with Gaza, but it has a Palestine problem. And this is why we can't look at what's happening in Gaza without understanding the West Bank. The Israeli Security Cabinet member and Agriculture Minister Avi Ditcher said, Gaza Nakba 2023. That's how it'll end. So there is this constant reference of going back to the Nakba, that they'll be repeating what they did during the Nakba, right? But as Palestinians have mentioned, and if we think about the logics of settler colonialism, there was never actually an ending to it. By referencing the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe, he is rhetorically linking Israel's current attacks against 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, with Israel taking over more than 3/4 of Palestine in 1948. The Nakba refers to the historical event of Palestinian expulsion from the historic Palestine in 1948. During this event, Zionist militias destroyed over 500 villages, expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their home, who comprised 80% of the indigenous population at the time, killed approximately 15,000 Palestinians in a series of massacres and mass atrocities, and wiped over 500 villages off the map. And just kind of like a brief history, I'm just kind of going to go through it. After the 1948 war, Egypt had occupied the Gaza Strip while Jordan controlled the West Bank. 200,000 Palestinian refugees fled to Gaza. Gaza was already home to 70,000 settlements where they all stayed in refugee camps. So it's important to note too that 70% of Palestinians in Gaza currently are previously displaced Palestinians from the 1948 Gaza. In Gaza, Egypt imposed martial law on Palestinians until 1962, severely restricting their settlement, employment, and movement. During this time in the year 1956, Israel forces committed 2 massacres against Gaza, one in Khan Yunis, killing 275 Palestinians, and one in Rafah, killing 110 Palestinians. As a result of the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel conquered and occupied the Gaza Strip, along with the West Bank, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. It was not until 2007 where Israel led a blockade against the Gaza Strip from land, air, and sea, after the Palestinian elections in the West Bank and the political party of Hamas took control over Gaza. Hamas began as an Islamic charity, first established in the 1970s, that evolved into a more militant organization in the 1990s and 2000, and then later took power in Gaza in 2007. So while the Nakba invasion began in 1948, Palestinians have regarded it as an ongoing structure that shapes life for all Palestinians, including contributing to the world's largest refugee population. The ongoing Nakba is similarly highlighted in the ways that Israel annexed land and power over time, expanding its history, expanding its territories, and eliminating the history, language, and people of Palestine. This ongoing structure, known as settler colonialism, is the process of removing the native population to replace it with a new settler entity. Founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, writes, "If I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct." This was said during like the early 1900s. This language of destroying in order to replace is revealed with this most current attack on Gaza. An Israeli, for instance, an Israeli real estate company portrays a sort of image on their Instagram of a new Israeli city on the ruins of Gaza. When a commentator asks, "Where is this city at?" the original poster replied, "We're clearing it now." So Israel's most current attack against Gaza already drove 1.6 Palestinians out of their homes in the Gaza Strip and has damaged or destroyed half of all of the housing. The number is way higher than that now. The number of Palestinians made homeless is already more than double those made of Palestinians made refugees in 1948. These are just some images to kind of think about the ways that confinement, refugeehood, expulsion are like sort of similar themes that we're seeing ongoing today. And I kind of want to just sort of end here to briefly say that, just like I had started, that despite this ongoing violence, the reason that it continues to stay ongoing and that it's not a finished project is because Palestinians, both in Palestine and in the diaspora, have constantly resisted. And that form of resistance has taken so many different shapes, including strikes, nonviolent demonstration, boycotts, divestments, protests, and honestly, just creating a more sustainable and livable life for themselves. It is evident in the Palestinians in Gaza today who simply refuse to leave their homes, ultimately paying the ultimate price. It is important that as people bearing witness to this genocide, like us, for instance, that we do not forget that we not forget that what we were fighting for ultimately is for a ceasefire, first and foremost. But after that, an end to the siege in Gaza, an end to the Israeli occupation and the liberation for all of Palestine. Thank you.
Wow, this is fabulous. Thank you so much, بيان. يعطيك العافية. كثير نورتي.
I hope I didn't go over, but
this is wonderful. You truly illuminated so many junctures and so many facets. And thank you for this very rich talk. I'm before people start collecting their questions, and I'm sure people would want to hear more specific things from you. I have a couple of questions to ask you. And as I'm a humanist, I'm a literary historian, and I am always thinking about language and how language kind of shapes and is in itself a trajectory towards a colonial future, or here the Zionist ideology's future that is very much, in all the examples that you gave, it's contingent about naming Palestinians as not individuals, as non-beings. So for an Israeli subject to come into being, there has to be some sort of entitlement to a colonial future that is predicated on the non-being of Palestinians that do not have are out of history and out of time and out of memory, and also not allowed to grieve and to do to perform what Hannah Arendt called the imperative of mourning. So I was really fascinated by the ways in which naming reproductive genocide kind of is in itself a counter narrative to the examples of the very, very, very anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian kind of expressions that you cited. The T-shirts were very, very significant. And how they are always centered around reproduction and this fear of being that a fetus carries, and it really and kind of and I was thinking about the U.S. Congressman because Steve King, when he was recognizing an ally in the fascist project in Holland, that the right-wing, extreme, fascist Dutch politician said something like, he said something like, and this is where Steve King says, Wilders understands that culture and demographics are our destiny. We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies. And your talk really kind of fleshed this out for me, how children or babies are so much this kind of point of revision of the past, but also a point of departure towards the project of elimination. And all this is to kind of think with you and tell you how much I appreciate that you framed it as a reproductive genocide, that you gave language to a project that is very much willfully and intentionally trying to repudiate, erase all kind of counter narrative and history and futurity that Palestinians embody as beings in the world. So that was like kind of my reflection, and I want to ask you about other instances where there was this moment of the project of elimination starts with language, and just tell us how kind of you came up with the framework of reproductive genocide.
Thank you so much for that reflection, and sometimes somebody can bounce back what you're trying to say in such a better way than what is in your head. So I really appreciate taking all of that in and being able to say that back. There's so many things that I could say, obviously, with this. One of them is like this idea. I want to speak on the about the language and thinking about the being and the non-being, and what we were seeing a lot in the very beginning of selective humanity, right? And this idea of grieving and whose bodies are allowed to be grieved and whose bodies are not. And one of the things that I can think about was the sort of the ways that in the beginning celebrities were coming out and putting pray for Israel and things like that. And there was a few instances. I think one of them was Justin Bieber, and one of them was another celebrity. Her name just kind of passed. Jamie Lee Curtis, I believe her name was, who had posted pray for Israel and posting images of what is Gaza and what are clearly Palestinian children, right? And when people were calling them out on it, it wasn't removed. It was immediately removed, but it wasn't corrected, right? So this idea that we can't even acknowledge that, oh, wait, it was actually Palestinians. We can't even say we want to pray for Palestinians, right? Without even getting into the issue or whatnot. So there's so much of this selective humanity that's happening. So much of that work of language is like already being done, both over there and here, right? And then the other thing I wanted to kind of mention, is like I've struggled so much, and I think I have a lot of other feminist colleagues that have been really helping me to work through this concept of reproductive genocide. Because part of what I also think about too is I look at demographics, I look at family separation, I look at disruption of families, I look at the ways that, just the type of ID that you carry in Palestine, whether you're in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, or in East Jerusalem, or even in the 1948 territories or modern day Israel, right? Impacts what kind of family you're allowed to have, what kind of reproductive decisions you're allowed to make. So it wasn't enough, it's not enough to simply count the bodies that are being killed, right? But the sort of, I look at, I mentioned in my talk, the spaces that are being targeted are spaces in a way designed to eliminate whole families, right? So like, for folks who aren't familiar, the way that families or Palestinian homes are in Gaza, but even elsewhere too in Palestine, but mainly in Gaza, is these tall, high-rise buildings, and there's different homes throughout them, right? And they're usually from like the same aile or the same families.
It's the same in Lebanon.
Yeah, it's the same in most of the Arab world, right? Like that's just how it is, and it's usually from the same families. So when one of the largest families to be completely eliminated in this had 86 members in it, right? So it wasn't just enough. It's not just enough to count sort of the bodies, but it's a way to show that the literal targeting, I say materially, but also discursively, right? With the shirts, with the language of it's not a coincidence that he used mothers, right? And it's very, it's very common. It is a way to eliminate families completely, right? And it's part of the logic of elimination. So just, a response to your wonderful reflection on that. That's, the issue is a lot larger than that. So thank you.
This is truly really, this is so helpful for all of us, and especially because Arab women and Palestinian women in particular are so much loaded with the signifiers of oppression and ignorance, and it doesn't stop. And to kind of this is going to be my final question, but kind of to reframe the conversation as part of the counter narrative, and to dispel all kind of the stereotypes that our bodies carry wherever they wherever they are, but particularly in this very, very contested and violent space of living in Gaza. I wanted to ask you if you can give us an inventory, and I know this is not a fair question, but a request, but if you can give us a kind of inventory of the Palestinian feminist human rights agenda, to make Palestinian women the people who are framing the narrative, and not that you are a Gaza in the diaspora, so you are the closest we have to centering the voice of Gazan, of the woman in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, my family's from the West Bank, so it's a little bit, but we're part of a city, as I mentioned in the beginning, in the Khalil, where literally folks that I know there literally are looking out of their windows and they could see the bombs dropping on Gaza. Like it's just that close, and Palestine itself is just not that large. And I think this is like, I struggle with this question, but I think it also leads to what I've been thinking about a Palestinian feminist future.
Mhm.
And it's still centered around reproduction, right? Because, you know, we think about the violence that comes with, you know, what we're talking about, reproductive genocide, right? But like, you know, there's this argument that like, how can it be genocide when Palestinians are constantly, you know, when there's, you know, the Palestinian population keeps growing, right? And this is like a totally obviously ignorant way of understanding what genocide is. But
Mhm.
it also illuminates the fact that, yeah, Palestinians, despite this type of violence, will continue to give birth to, you know, will continue to reproduce and will continue to create life. And I look at, you know, I have a segment in my talk too, where I look at the spaces of beauty in Gaza. And I think that's part of the Palestinian feminist human
Yeah.
rights agenda, right? Like that there's no fuel, there's no electricity, and they're coming up with these creative ways of just making bread, right? Making bread and kind of sharing it with everyone, right? I think like Palestinians are just so feminist in that way. You know,
Yeah.
it's that the are, you know, and I think, you know, Arabs in general, but you know, the idea of collectivity as a feminist
Yeah.
project, right? And
Yeah.
part of the feminist future, I think
Mhm.
is what, you know, has held on, and that's sort of, you know, why we can imagine a Palestinian future. So, you know, I probably didn't answer your question as best
No, no, it's
the way that I'm thinking about it,
yeah,
you
no,
know,
it's
just
very,
graphic.
very helpful. And I love that you framed your talk with storytelling and the storytelling about life and about agency in the middle of all dispossession, all colonial attempts of dispossession, that you started with agency and these pockets of joy. Because, you know, we also believe liberation is the politics of joy. So I am going to stop. Otherwise, I'm going to, you know,
Keep talking.
keep on asking you questions, but I'm going to cede the floor to first my colleague, Charlene Fletcher, who is an assistant professor of history. And Dr. Fletcher is going to give us a kind of present a code of conduct to preface the Q&A. Thank you. Shukran.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. We are grateful that you are here. We are excited that you are here for the RGSS Night School. We welcome your questions, and I wanted to just take a moment because we have several excellent questions in the Q&A box that I will share, and we can move into those. But I wanted to remind everyone that this is a safe space for not only learning, but for solidarity. And so we hope to have a fruitful conversation where we can foster that environment. And so it is imperative that we engage respectfully so that we can learn from one another and we can grow. And so with that, I'm going to jump right into some of the questions that we have here. The first is straightforward. Why are people claiming or arguing that this is not genocide if the destruction and the killing is so blatant? What are their points, and how can we combat them?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Obviously my first instinct is to be like, you know, I don't know why, right? But I think it's sort of the weight that genocide, the terminology of genocide carries as, you know, something that is only relegated to certain, can only happen to certain people. I think similar to the ways that like we've understood things like the Holocaust, right, to pertain to only you know, a certain incident and things like that. And I think I mentioned it earlier, but one of the reasons why, you know, folks, or one of the reasons why folks are saying that this isn't a genocide is that the Palestinian population does continue to grow, and people's idea of genocide being that it's supposed to just, you know, reduce, um you know, that's really it. I mean, I think what was so important was the way that South Africa brought Israel to trial, right? And even though they had ruled that it was plausible for genocide, right? Not necessarily calling it as genocide. It is the first time that Israel has kind of been, single, is sort of in the middle of the world's attention, right? In the way that everybody is looking now at Israel. And I think it was a huge win for South Africa because, for South Africa and for Palestine, because it sets a precedent that, we're going to hold these colonial powers accountable, right? So, I think these are things that we can continue to do. I think trying to understand how, like I pointed out, it's, body count is important, but it's also about the spaces that are being targeted, right? Is intentional for getting, for eliminating families, for eliminating children, things like that. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. And just a quick note, as a historian of confinement, I appreciate you bringing up it's not just about a body count, but the spaces in which we find confinement and the multiplicity of it, particularly when it comes to reproductive justice or lack thereof. Next question. Why is the watermelon the symbol for this movement?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of it's actually interesting because my partner is, has lived most of his life in Palestine in the West Bank. And I spoke with him about the watermelon and he had no idea what it was, right? And it was, there's a lot of going back and forth of whether this actually exists. But there's this sort of narrative that during the 1970s, Palestinians were not allowed to don their Palestinian flag, so that the watermelon represents the colors of the Palestinian flag, the red, the black, and the green, and then obviously the white. So that's kind of been the symbol of it. Instead of having a Palestinian flag, there's an image of a watermelon. And that's all I could really say about that.
Why do you think people like to start the timeline on October 7th when it's clear that this has been going on for so much longer? How can we articulate that more to those who don't want to look further in the past beyond October 7th?
That's a really great question. Because I think people also like to be very ahistorical. I think I think folks are very nervous about a starting point, and it makes it easier to just say that something started at a certain time, right? To sort of, you can say that this started on October 7 because what Israel is doing is a direct response to the Hamas operation, right? And I think it's also because people don't understand the context of the siege, for instance, right? That the conditions of the siege, it's been over 17 years, right? Has led to Palestinians, and we're talking about multiple ways of resistance, right? We're not just, referring to the Hamas operation, but, back in 2019, 2020, the Great March of Return, where Palestinians were constantly protesting at the border in Gaza, and as a result, were directly shot by it. There, and even before it. So I think people like to begin on October 7th too, because of the idea too that Israel and Palestine is an issue, as a complicated issue, and they like to, don't want to take accountability to really understand what's going on by just calling it something complicated, right? And so, and I think people do that in other contexts too. We forget that, places like Australia, places like Canada, places like the United States are also settler colonial nations, predicated on the dispossession of, Native folks, predicated on the, criminalization of Black and brown folks, for instance, right? I think it's the kind of the same, the sort of same logic. It's just easier. How can we articulate it to those? I think that's just one of them. And I think, 1948, it doesn't necessarily have to be a starting point route two, but I think just trying to understand this as an ongoing structure helps to kind of illuminate what's happening.
Absolutely. Can you elaborate? I'm sorry, the questions are moving. One moment. Okay. Can you elaborate on the phrase "from the river to the sea"? Where did it come from, and why, in some contexts, is it seen as being hate speech?
All right. So what I could say about this is it's a very popular chant amongst pro-Palestinian solidarity activists. And, there's whoever you are might have different reasons for saying it, but the primary reason for why folks are saying "from the river to the sea" means to break down the borders as they exist today, dividing, the nations into the West Bank, into the Gaza Strip, into Israel, and going back to the historical borders before 1948, right? Which is going back to historic Palestine, which includes, from the river to the sea. So it's going back to historic Palestine. And, some contexts that it's obviously being framed as a genocidal statement against Jewish people. But like I said, that's not actually what it is. But then you have people like Netanyahu saying from from the river to the sea too, right? And that's not considered genocide anymore. And I think it is a way to kind of deflect the genocide claim too, that Israel's not actually committing genocide by claiming that, no, it's actually pro-Palestinians who believe in genocide. And this is why, what's happening to the people in Gaza are actually happening to them. So, yeah, thank you.
What has caused the dehumanization of Palestinian individuals?
I think this is part of being part of the dispossessed group, part of the group that is being oppressed. There's, in order to humanize the colonizer, as Dr. Asaf Kafantar had mentioned earlier, that in order for somebody to be, somebody has to not be, right? So I think this sort of this sort of relationship that in order for the Israeli subject, the Israeli human, or to become human, that it needs to be predicated on a non-human. So the constant dehumanization of Palestinians is necessary for the Israeli subject to begin. It's similar to the ways that we cannot have white without having black, right? It's sort of predicated on that relationship to make it visible. To make the Israeli subject seem as the progressive, the modern, the European, right? And sort of Palestinians as the non-humans, the backwards, the not utilizing their land well enough, the taking up empty space, etc. So it's sort of necessary for any sort of power relations, especially if we're thinking structurally with the logics of settler colonialism.
What are the US and other countries' reasons or motivations for continuing and supporting the genocide? Why have they refused to put any pressure on Israel?
As they themselves are guilty of this too, so like the idea that a lot of people say that it's because of oh, Israel, the United States needs Israel because it needs this sort of ally in the Middle East, right? I think that's just part of the story. I think it's more ideological. I think it's more trying to align with other powers, other colonial powers, which is why, like, even just the declaration of the state of Israel, you had people like Britain and the United States who were competing to, recognize the state of Israel immediately, right, with each other. And I think that's sort of like an ideological relationship or sort of understanding, right? And the fact that, excuse me, I feel like I did so well so far.
You're fine, don't worry.
Thank you. They themselves, like I said, are guilty of this, you know. I like, and I think this is another reason, the question earlier about like, why are they denying genocide? Like, the United States is guilty of genocide. Britain is guilty of committing genocide, right? Against its indigenous inhabitants, against its Black inhabitants. So, you know, I think that's a huge, I think that's a huge part of it. The fact that, you know, settler colonialism has not ended in those countries either. So yeah, that's, you know, that's all I'm going to say for that.
Absolutely. And I think at some point over the course of the night school, we will likely hear about um, shared solidarities because of the impact of settler colonialism. And just off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Palestinian support uh, for African Americans when it came to Ferguson. I'm thinking of Palestinian support of indigenous nations when it came to Standing Rock. And so there, those elements, there's a shared experience there, right?
Yeah. I mean, even just if we just want to think about the prison industrial complex, or just thinking
Absolutely.
about prisons and the you know, the border, the certain private prisons in the United States, or even just prisons itself, and even the wall and the checkpoints in Israel, they're made by the same company, right? So it's like these, you know, I'm so excited for the talks around solidarity, because they're not simply like, hey, like we see you, but like our struggles are intertwined.
Intertwined.
So it's going to be
Absolutely.
an incredible conversation.
Absolutely. This is a related question. When we talk about the reproductive aspect of this event, would you consider it to be a form of eugenics? How does this affect what we already know?
Yeah, that's a very great question, actually. And I had just finished up an article too, writing about the history of eugenics, looking at immigration laws, and how the, you know, basically the Immigration Act of 1924, for instance, in the United States, which was, you know, set quotas for who can come to the United States, was also predicated on medical selection, and it was sort of predicated on which bodies are able to immigrate. And so those with like certain diseases or physical ailments, or even things like alcoholism or whatnot, were denied entry. And this is similar logics to the law of return in Israel, where they also had medical selection, and they were discouraged by having people with disabilities enter the country, right? Because I think this idea of creating the strong, the most physically fit, the most mentally, you know, intelligent, the biggest and brightest, right? Sort of population, is also this like white phenomenon. And I think the way that we're understanding, you know, reproductive genocide in Gaza, in the West Bank, and just sort of eliminating Palestinians as part of this eugenics project, to cleanse those who just don't fit in what the Jewish, or, you know, what the Jewish state had always imagined itself to be. So yeah, absolutely is a form of eugenics, right? And I think it's also important, you know, I don't mention it in this talk, but this kind of reproductive genocide that I'm interested in, or that you know, that we can also think about in the context of Israel and Palestine, is not just you know, it's not just discouraging Palestinian births, right? Or Palestinians from having children, but it's also about controlling Arab Jewish children, or Arab Jewish populations. Israel has this history of forcibly injecting Depo-Provera against Ethiopian immigrants prior to immigrating into Israel, right? So also controlling what kind of Jewish populations are actually allowed to be part of the state. So I think when we think of reproduction, or if we center reproduction and reproductive justice, it kind of opens up, you know, a lot of different ways to understanding, you know, the Jewish state, and that Zionism is not just bad for Palestinians, right, but is bad for everyone, you know. So yeah, that's a really great question. And I hope that, that it kind of helps. I think there's so much more that I can say about that, but I could stop there.
And so many other correlations to make as well
So
in various
many.
places. Absolutely. I'm gonna combine these three questions because they're related. They're asking the same thing. And it's really around resources and research and avoiding um, I hate to say the phrase, but fake news. So being able to get actual information. And so when doing research, what sources would you consider reliable to get the truth of what is happening in Palestine? Considering there is so much false news spread on social media, that's the first question. And then in the similar vein, just so you can hear the questions, how do you recognize what is true or false information in a world where media can be corrupted and changed to fit a certain narrative? And if you had to pick one book or resource piece that we should start with for our learning journeys, what would it be? So three similar questions, but that's what, and I can go through them again just in case.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think, okay, just a few sources that can possibly, be very helpful. I'm part of the Palestinian Feminist Collective as well. And I think trying to combat this idea of fake news has been, it's been a sort of priority, right? Because like everyone totally understands that there's so much stuff out there. Or even just, even if it's not even about bypassing fake news, it's about where do you start, So they have a website, or we have a website, and we've created something called the Palestinian Feminist Toolkit. And the women in that group just did a phenomenal job of putting in news articles, books, different books to read, art, music, culture, a bunch of different types of things to understand or contextualize what's currently going on today in Gaza. So I would say to start there. I can drop the link to in a bit. Another really great site or website is Jadaliya, that every single week has been posting some sort of video called Gaza in Context. I don't know if you can hear it. My toddler's like knocking on the door. Have been posting a Gaza in Context every single week, and all of their stuff is online. It's on YouTube. And I think the question, honestly, I don't know how to answer it. But like, how do you, know whether something is fake news or is propaganda or whatnot? Like the sources I mentioned are a really great starting point. So once you kind of get a sense of what's on there, you can get a sense of what's considered propaganda. But ultimately, I think it's just about just being well read. And don't take things as you see it. Just continue to do the readings and talking to people about it, because I think what is happening now, and what's probably like I'm teaching an intro to women and gender studies this year, and I'm really excited because I think this is the first time that I could talk to students about Palestine and they actually know where it is. So I think the times have changed. I think people have a better sense of what's happening or what it is. So it's a lot easier to have these kind of conversations. And, there's different organizations like the Students for Justice of Palestine. I'm not sure what the culture is in Butler, but, I think they do so much great work too at bringing in, people to come speak. I think different departments do that too. So just keeping an open mind and really going into those. And those are things that I would say. And in terms of a book, I have no idea. Like the first one that came to mind is by, like a really down Israeli historian, but I rather would just not, I would rather point you towards, work by Palestinians. And I think that's really important to kind of, a book that was really important to my foundations or my, political consciousness is any work by Rashid Khalidi. And then there's a book by Rhoda Kanane called Birthing the Nation, and I think it's centered around Palestinian reproduction. But it's really good at really understanding like the way that, the history of Palestinian reproduction, and understanding the history generally. So I hope I was able to answer those.
Definitely. I think you did.
That was
Purpose.
a lot. Yeah, I was like trying to follow along.
Um, so I'm gonna share one more question, and we have a couple of more, but I'm sure that we'll answer those tomorrow, because again, this is just the first night of the night school. And so this last question, just in the interest of time, is a comment and a question. So thank you so much for opening this important conversation for us. Returning to the theme of tonight's seminar, Feminism at the Border, I was wondering how we can bring the border closer to home. Midwest, private college, overwhelmingly white school, etc. As an educator, can you share your effective strategies for providing a humanized narrative of Palestine amidst the paralyzing scale of violence that is at the heart of the genocide? I'm thinking about the power, both the power of language, a nod to Mira's point, whilst reading Adanya Shabili's work that quietly and eerily visualizes the horrors of living under military occupation in Palestine, not to overwhelm, but to ignite solidarity and empathy.
A really great question. I have no doubt that I'm sure the next couple of days, there's going to be ways to strategize this a lot more, thinking in the context of solidarities. Um, but I think, the first thing that comes to mind is why I started the talk the way that I started it. I think sometimes when we talk about Palestine or we talk about Gaza, we talk about Palestinians, we talk about them in a way that's like, we feel bad for them or we pity them, or they're just always in this, like, I think we kind of reified these same ideas of dehumanization, right? That Palestinians are always victims. And that's never, that's not the case, that despite this, like, unimaginable, like, you know, like horrors of death and destruction, right? And I want to mention that obviously what's happening to Palestinians is not something that's exceptional, right? That's not something that we haven't seen before. We've seen indigenous folks, we've seen Black folks, we've seen brown folks resisting unimaginable horrors, right? In ways, if we think about the sort of everyday acts, the ways that they continue to create families and cultivate community, in the face of death and destruction. I think constantly kind of reminding people about that, helps to, like, humanize them, right? And I think that's why I didn't focus so much on, I've done teach-ins and stuff like this, where I focused on numbers and I focused on this many journalists were killed and I focused on this many, Palestinian, all these different statistics. But I think the constant using of numbers and whatnot does do the work of dehumanization. So being able to talk about the violence in a different way, being able to shed light to about what Palestine and what Gaza was and continues to be, that people today will still say, like, despite all this destruction, Gaza is still beautiful, right? So that's kind of how I want to end that.
Thank you so much. This has been amazing. I will turn it over to my dear colleague, Tia Van Hester, so that she can close us out for the evening.
Thank you, and Dr. Fletcher. What a fabulous talk. So illuminating. Thank you for providing so much important context for us to move forward with this night school. It's so important to get perspectives from people within that culture, but also recognizing that it is not only the work of Palestinian women and feminists to do this work. So we really appreciate you kicking us off. And thank you so much for everybody who participated. If your question wasn't answered, we went ahead and took it down, and hopefully we'll be able to answer it tomorrow or during the Wednesday session. But before we go, if you were unaware, we have another speaker coming tomorrow, and that is Malka Bird with Jewish Voices for Peace, Indiana, who is going to kind of talk to us about local organizing and solidarity work uh, amongst identities that are often portrayed as very contentious, but really work together from a humanized perspective. And before my conversation with her, I'm going to give us a little brief background on what transnational feminism is. I think we hear the term a lot, and I think it's really important for us to kind of understand what are the key tenets of that, as opposed to Black feminist thought or Chicana feminisms or Palestinian feminist work. What does it mean to be a transnational feminist? So we will kick off with that tomorrow. And then Wednesday, just as a reminder, is a panel roundtable discussion with Dr. Fletcher, Dr. Asaf Kafantaris, and myself, kind of wrapping things up. So keep the questions coming. We hope to see you at tomorrow and Wednesday's session. And everybody who has participated tonight, remember there'll be an email with all of the resources that were discussed. Me and Dr. Fletcher were Starship Enterprising at our table, making sure we wrote everything down. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow if you're available and getting that information to you. So with Solidarity, thanks so much and have a great night.
Thank you.